Welcome back, YouTubers, and good morning. Time for Chapter 8 of this book, The Turner Diaries. November 4, 1992. Soup and bread again tonight, and not much of that. Our money is almost gone, and there still hasn't been anything from WFC. If our pay doesn't come through in the next couple of days, we'll have to resort to armed robbery again, an unpleasant prospect. Unit 2 still has what seems to be an unlimited supply of food, and we'd already be in a much worse way if they hadn't given us that carload of canned goods a month ago, especially since we now have 7 mouths to feed. But it is just too dangerous to drive up to Maryland for our food supply. The chances are too great of running into a police roadblock. That is the most noticeable, and to the public, it must be by far the most irritating consequence to date of our terror campaign. Travel by private automobile has become, at least in the Washington area, a nightmare, with enormous traffic jams everywhere, caused by the police checks. In the last few days, this police activity has increased significantly, and it looks as if it will remain a regular feature of life for the foreseeable future. So far, however, they haven't been stopping pedestrians, bicyclists, or buses. We can still get around, although less conveniently than before. Oops, there go the lights again. This is the second time this evening we've had to break out the candles. Until this year, the worst power shortages have occurred in the summer. But it's November now, and we're still stuck with the temporary 15% voltage reduction they imposed in July. Even this perpetual brownout isn't saving us from an increasing number of voluntary blackouts. It's obvious that somebody's profiting from the power shortage, though. When Catherine was lucky enough to find some candles at one of the grocery stores last week, she had to pay $1.50 a piece for them. The price of kerosene and gasoline lanterns has gone out of sight, but the hardware stores never have any of them in stock anyway. When I next have some free time, I'll see what I can improvise in that direction. We have been maintaining the pressure against the system during the past week with a lot of one-man, low-risk activities. There have been approximately 40 grenade attacks against federal buildings and media facilities in Washington. For example, our unit is responsible for 11 of them. Since it is now virtually impossible to enter any federal building except a post office without a complete body search, we have had to be ingenious. On one occasion, Henry simply pulled the pin on a fragmentation grenade and then slipped it down between 2 cartons on a big pallet of freight waiting outside the freight door of the Washington Post, wedging it so that the safety lever was held in place by the cartons. He didn't wait around, but news reports later confirmed that there was an explosion inside the post building which killed 1 employee and seriously wounded 3 others. Most often, however, we have used grenade throwers improvised from shotguns. They give us a maximum range of more than 150 yards, but the grenade always explodes sooner than that unless the delay element is modified. All one needs to use them efficiently is a place of concealment within about 100 yards of the target. We have fired from the back seat of a moving auto, from the restroom window of an adjacent building, and at night from a patch of shrubbery in a small park across the street from the target building. With luck, one can hit a window and get an explosion inside an office or a corridor. But even when the grenade bounces off an outside wall, the explosion shatters windows and the shrapnel keeps people jumping. If we keep it up long enough, we can probably force the government to shutter all the windows in federal buildings, which will certainly help raise the consciousness of federal workers. But it is clear that we can't maintain this kind of activity indefinitely. We lost one of our best activists yesterday, Roger Green from Unit 8, and we are bound to lose more as time passes. The system must inevitably win any sort of war of attrition, considering the numerical advantage they have over us. We have talked this problem over among ourselves many times, and we always come back to the same stumbling block. A revolutionary attitude is virtually non-existent in America. Outside the organization, and all our activities to date don't seem to have changed this fact. The masses of people certainly aren't in love with the system. In fact, their grumbling has increased steadily over the past 6 or 7 years as living conditions have deteriorated. But they are still far too comfortable and complacent to entertain the idea of revolt. On top of this is the enormous disadvantage we suffer from having the system controlling the image of us which reaches the public. We receive a continuous feedback from our legals on what the public is thinking, and most people have accepted without hesitation the system's portrayal of us as gangsters and murderers. Without some sort of empathy between us and the general public, we can never find enough new recruits to make up for our losses. And with the system controlling virtually every channel of communication with the public, it's hard to see how we are going to develop that empathy. Our leaflets and the occasional seizure of a broadcasting station for a few minutes just can't make much headway against the nonstop torrent of brainwashing the system uses for keeping the people in line. The lights have just come on again. Now that I'm ready to hit the sack, sometimes I think the system's own weakness will bring about its downfall just as quickly without our help as with it. The incessant power failures are only one crack among thousands in this crumbling edifice we are trying so desperately to pull down. November 8th. The last few days have seen a major change in our domestic affairs. The population in our shop increased to 8 last Thursday, and now it's down to 4 again. Myself, Catherine, Bill, and Carol Hanrahan, formerly of Unit 6. Henry and George have teamed up with Edna Carlson, who also came to us after Unit 6 disaster, and with Dick Wheeler, the only survivor of a police raid on Unit 11's hideout Thursday. The 4 of them have moved to a new location in the district. The new arrangement has us better divided among functional lines than before, as well as solving the personal problem which had been worrying Catherine and me. We, here in the shop, are now essentially a technical services unit, while the 4 who left are a sabotage and assassination unit. Bill Hanrahan is a machinist and mechanic, and a printer. Until 2 months ago, he and Carol operated a printing shop in Alexandria. His wife doesn't share his mechanical genius, but she is a reasonably competent printer. As soon as we get another press set up here, her job will be to produce many of the leaflets and other propaganda materials which the organization clandestinely distributes in this area. I will continue to be responsible for the organization's communications equipment and for specialized ordnance. Bill will assist me with the latter and will also be our gunsmith and armory keeper. Catherine will have a chance to exercise her editorial skills again, to a limited extent, in that she will have the responsibility for transforming the typewritten propaganda we receive from WFC into camera-ready headlines and text for Carol. She will be able to use her own discretion in making condensations, deletions, and other changes necessary for copy fitting. Bill and I finished our first special ordnance job together yesterday. We modified a 4.2-inch mortar to handle 81 millimeter projectiles. The modification was necessary because we have so far been unable to pick up an 81 millimeter mortar for the projectiles which we grabbed in the raid on Aberdeen Proving Grounds last month. One of our gun buff members, however, had a serviceable 4.2-inch mortar which he had kept hidden away since the late 1940s. The organization is planning a very important mission in the next day or two in which the mortar will be used, and Bill and I were under pressure to finish the job on time. Our main difficulty was in finding a piece of steel tube of the right inside diameter to weld inside the 4.2-inch tube. Since we have no lathe or other machine tools at this time, once we found a supplier for the tube, the rest was fairly easy, and we are proud of the result. Although it weighs more than 3 times as much as an 81 millimeter mortar should, today we did a job which was simple enough in theory, but which gave us more trouble in practice than we had anticipated. Melting the explosive filler out of the 500-pound bomb casing with a great deal of straining and swearing, and with several good burns from the boiling water, we managed to splash all over ourselves. We got most of the tritonol explosive from the bomb into a variety of empty grapefruit juice cans, peanut butter jars, and other containers. The work took all day and exhausted everyone's patience. But now we have the makings for enough medium-sized bombs to last us for months. I think I will find Bill Haranahan's congenial comrade in arms for carrying out our unit's new duties for the organization. We are now designated Unit 6, and I am in charge. Certainly the new living arrangement here is more congenial for Catherine and me, now that we are sharing our building with other married couple instead of with 2 bachelors. I just wrote another married couple, but of course that was a slip of the pen since Catherine and I are not formally married. In the last 2 months, and particularly in the last 2 or 3 weeks, however, we have experienced so much together and become so dependent on one another for companionship that a bond at least as strong as that of marriage has developed between us. In the past, whenever one of us had an organizational assignment to carry out, we usually contrived to work together on it. Now such collaboration will not require any contrivance. It is interesting that the organization, which has imposed on all of us a life which is unnatural for in many respects, has led to a more natural relationship between the sexes inside the organization than exists outside. Although unmarried female members are theoretically equal to male members in that they are subject to the same discipline, our women are actually cherished and protected to a much larger degree than women in the general society are. Consider rape, for example, which has become such an omnipresent pestilence these days. It had already been increasing at a rate of 20 to 25% per year since the early 1970s until last year, when the Supreme Court ruled that all laws making rape a crime are unconstitutional because they presume a legal difference between the sexes. Rape, the judges ruled, can only be prosecuted under the statutes covering non-sexual assaults. In other words, rape has been reduced to the status of a punch in the nose. In cases where no physical injury can be proved, it is now virtually impossible to obtain a prosecution or even an arrest. The result of this judicial mischief has been that the incidence of rape has zoomed to the point that the legal statisticians have recently estimated that 1 out of every 2 American women can expect to be raped at least once in her lifetime. In many of our big cities, of course, the statistics are much worse. The women's lib groups have greeted this development with dismay. It isn't exactly what they had in mind when they began agitating for equality 2 decades ago. At least there's dismay among the rank and file of such groups. I have a suspicion that their leaders, most of whom are Jewesses, had this outcome in mind from the beginning. Black civil rights spokesmen, on the other hand, have had only praise for the Supreme Court's decision. Rape laws, they said, are racist because a disproportionately large number of blacks have been charged under them. Nowadays, gangs of black thugs hang around parking lots and schoolyards and roam the corridors of office buildings and apartment complexes, looking for an attractive, unescorted white girl and knowing that punishment, either from the disarmed citizenry or the handcuffed police, is extremely unlikely. Gang rapes in school classrooms have become an especially popular new sport. Some particularly liberal women may find that this situation provides a certain amount of satisfaction for their masochism, a way of atoning for their feelings of racial guilt, but for normal white women it is a daily nightmare. One of the sickest aspects of the whole thing is that many young whites, instead of opposing this new threat to their race, have apparently decided to join it. White rapists have become more common, and there have even been instances of integrated rape gangs recently. Nor have the girls remained entirely passive. Sexual debauchery of every sort on the part of the young, white men and women, and even children in their preteens, has reached a level which would have been unimaginable only 2 or 3 years ago. The queers, the fetishists, and the mixed-race couples, the sadists, and the exhibitionists, urged on by the mass media, are parading their perversions in public, and the public is joining them. Just last week, when Catherine and I went into the district to pick up the salaries for our unit, which finally came through, when we were down nearly to our last can of soup, there was a nasty little incident. While we were waiting at a bus stop for a homeward bound bus, I decided to run into a drugstore a few feet away to buy a newspaper. I was gone for no more than 20 seconds, but when I came back, a greasy-looking youth, approximately white, but with the afro hairstyle popular among young degenerates, was taunting Catherine with obscenities while dancing and weaving around her like a boxer. Note to the reader. Afro refers to the Negro or African race, which until its sudden disappearance during the Great Revolution exerted an increasingly degenerative influence on the culture and lifestyles of the inhabitants of North America. I grabbed him by the shoulder, spun him around, and hit him in the face as hard as I could. As he went down, I had the deep, primitive satisfaction of seeing 4 or 5 of his teeth come washing out of his shattered mouth on a copious flow of dark red blood. I reached into my pocket for my pistol, fully intending to kill him on the spot, but Catherine seized my arm and caution returned. Instead of shooting him, I straddled him and directed 3 kicks at his groin with all my strength. He jerked and convulsively and emitted a short, choking scream with the first kick, and then he lay still. Passers-by averted their eyes and hurried on. Across the street, 2 blacks gawked and hooted. Catherine and I hurried around the corner. We walked about 6 blocks, then doubled back and caught the bus at another stop. Catherine told me later that the youth had run up to her as soon as I had entered the drugstore. He had put his arm around her, propositioned her and started pawing at her breasts. She is fairly strong and agile, and she was able to jerk away from him, but he blocked her from following me into the drugstore. As a rule, Catherine carries a pistol, but the day was unseasonably warm, unsuited for a coat, and she wore clothes which left no room for concealing a firearm. Since she was with me, she didn't even bother to carry one of the tear gas canisters, which have become essential articles of dress for women these days. In that regard, it is interesting to note that the same people who agitated so hysterically for gun confiscation before the Cohen Act are now calling for tear gas to be outlawed too. There have even been cases recently where women who used their tear gas to fend off would-be rapists have been charged with armed assault. The world has become so crazy that nothing really comes as a surprise anymore. In contrast to the situation outside, rape inside the organization is almost unthinkable. But there is no doubt at all in my mind that if a genuine case of forcible rape did occur, the perpetrator would be rewarded with 8 grams of lead within a matter of hours. When we got back to the shop, Henry and another man were waiting for us. Henry wanted me to give him a final rundown on the sight settings for the motor we had modified. When they left, they took the motor with them. I still didn't know what they will use it for. Catherine and I are both very fond of Henry, and we will miss his presence in our new unit. He is the kind of person on whom the success of the organization will ultimately depend. Catherine had already taught Henry most of her tricks of makeup and disguise, and when he left with the mortar, she gave him the greater part of her supply of wigs, beards, plastic gizmos, and cosmetics. And that's it for today, folks. Come back tonight. We'll do the breakdown of the chapter, and then come back tomorrow morning for chapter 9.